We have nothing in modern Christian life to compare to the temple in the Bible. When Jesus goes in and chases out the money changers, it was a dramatic moment. There are few religious reformers who have a moment as equal to that. We pay less attention to the comment that he would not allow people to carry things through the temple. I'll be honest and say years back I never thought too much about it. I simply assumed it referred to people carrying goods in to be sold, something of that nature. Then I ran across a scholar who said this referred to people who had begun using the temple area as a shortcut. If I'd read that before, it didn't register. It just didn't have the dramatic impact of Jesus overturning the tables and chasing the money changers out. If the walls of the temple could talk, they would have an amazing story to tell. In the early religious life of the Israelites, the people had been nomads. There was no fixed point in geography. There was no real estate that was a focus for their faith. Jacob might set up a stone where he'd had a dream, but that isn't the same as building a pyramid. As the people became more settled, it is natural that some shrines became increasingly important. For example, prophets such as Eli and later Samuel were located at Shiloh. And there's a value to a location that humans have always appreciated. We are creatures of 5 physical senses. We like things that we can experience physically. Places become special in our eyes. For the religious community, it was also practical, because if you want to find a prophet, it helps if you know where he or she is likely to be. David thought about building a temple to God, but was told he wasn't worthy. Now, the stories of Solomon don't impress me with that much greater worthiness, but he was still allowed to go ahead. Unfortunately, he used a lot of impressed labor for that and other programs, and that practice was what came back to bite the country in two after Solomon died. Israel became 2 kingdoms known as Israel and Judah. The temple in Jerusalem was in Judah, the southern kingdom. Almost 600 years before Jesus was born, Nebuchadnezzar plundered the temple. On his second visit, he burned it along with most of the city. Leaders would later be displeased that the people were content to leave God's house in ruins as long as their own houses had been rebuilt. But scholars tell us that a second temple was built through the efforts of Zerubbabel. This temple stood for about 500 years, a century longer than the first one stood. In 20 BC, the second temple, though, was dismantled in order to build a new and greater one. Of course, this was done by someone the Israelites didn't especially care for, Herod the Great. The temple would be destroyed in 70 AD as a response to the attempted revolution by Israel against Rome, and the temple has never been rebuilt again. After the destruction of the temple, the practice of sacrifice no longer took place, because that only took place at the temple. The focus of Jewish religious life became the synagogue. Today, people point to a place called the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock is. This is a place where Muslims believe God spoke to Muhammad. The Arab Muslims, of course, are also the children of Abraham through Ishmael. There's a minority group in Israel that would cheerfully dismantle the Dome of the Rock in order to rebuild the temple. An attempt in that direction would start a massive religious war that would almost certainly become global. This would be the irony of all ironies, for Jerusalem is supposed to mean the city of peace. Some years ago, I saw a history program on the temple, and I heard compelling arguments that tradition has it wrong. The Temple Mount is not where the temple actually was. Not everyone agrees on where they think the temple was, but they make a good argument that it isn't where the Dome of the Rock is. I won't repeat the complexities of it, but it sounds as if the temple stood in a lower elevation where there was a spring to provide water, for example, for washing away the masses of blood from the sacrifices. And when I heard that, my ears went on alert because of this comment from Mark that Jesus had stopped people from carrying things through the temple. When the scholar wrote that people had been using the temple as a shortcut, all I could think of was, well, gee, that's not very convenient. Not if it's way up high in the location we've always pictured the temple in. I mean, you don't climb up way high in order to save effort and time. You would go around rather than to climb a great deal. If the temple actually was lower and more centrally located in the old city, it would make much more sense, to me at least, that people would be using it as a shortcut. The location of the temple is mostly an interesting puzzle. Wouldn't it be great, though, if archaeologists could help bring peace on this issue? For Jesus and the disciples, the temple was extremely important. Jesus came to Jerusalem on a number of occasions. He always spent Passover there. A symbolic act at the temple, like driving out the money changers, stopping people from passing through, had much more significance there than it would have had any place else. And what if people had begun using the temple as a convenient shortcut? We know all about people using our property in Fortuna as a shortcut. Folks do it frequently. We get concerned because they don't clean up after their dogs, or they leave dangerous trash behind sometimes. We think about what if they tripped and fell. Sometimes we may feel like church property should get just a little more respect than that. But we also do want to have a hospitable spirit. We'd like them to at least think about God as they go past our property. Perhaps the temple leaders felt the same, and that's why they had never stopped people from using it as a shortcut. They were hoping maybe they'll think of God as they pass through. Or maybe it was too much trouble to object. Perhaps they figured that as long as it wasn't the Holy of Holies that they were treading over, it didn't matter. Or maybe they figured it was good to get people on religious soil for any reason. I've known a few church statisticians who would have used it for showing increased attendance at the church. Look how successful we are. But this was the temple. This was not a temple like a church or a monument. There was only one temple in a country that was, in theory at least, all of the same faith. But they were just using it as a shortcut? Did Jesus ask the question of whether they were treating God in the same way? They were passing through without thought or significance. They weren't paying attention. And you have to question it. If they do it at the temple where faithful visitors from around the world were present, mightn't they be doing it that way in their daily lives? Just passing through without paying much attention to God. And my guess is that Jesus was much more concerned about those things than he was about a place. Know that we're in God's universe. Never take anything for granted. Pay attention. Amen.